So welcome everybody to the second in our series of webinars relating to the Data Curation Network and the activities that are going on there. My name is John Wheeler, and I want to welcome you to the RDAP Primerpalooza, introducing data curation primers, presented to the RDAP community, research data access and preservation community by the DCN and Primer authors from Specialized Data Curation Workshop at the 2018 DLF Forum. Just as a note, we will be recording today's webinar and sharing it out through the usual listservs that we use to announce these events. Everybody should be muted. There is a Q&A that will take place through the chat interface. If you have a question that comes up, please feel free to type it in when it occurs to you, but we'll be having a Q&A at the end of the webinar after the primers have been presented. Do everyone please adhere to the code of conduct for the RDAP code of conduct for online interactions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers for today, who will be introducing the primer presenters, Cynthia Hudson Vitale from Pennsylvania State University and Anna Hadley from Pennsylvania State University. Okay, thanks.
Cool, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome,
yeah.
I'm seeing a head shake. That's great. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us for this RDAP webinar. We are introducing a new resource for your curation toolkit, Data Curation Primers. And we've had a lot of discussion on whether it's primers or primers. We're going with primers, but there might be a slip up, just to warn you. So let me just make sure my slides are going. Thank you. So I'm Cynthia Hudson Vitale. I'm the head of research informatics and publishing at Penn State University, and I'm the PI on the grant that is supporting the training workshops and primer development. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the Data Curation Network, which has initiated a lot of this work and its mission. Following that, we'll have Hannah Hadley, who is the project manager on the Dcn Education Initiative, provide details about the primer development and the education workshops. And this will be followed by a lightning talk style presentation by the rest of the primer group, excuse me. And you can see here who these folks are, and we'll be introducing them more as we kind of go along. So a little bit of background about the Data Curation Network. This project is funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and it initially focused on sharing staffing to expertly curate research data, but has really kind of expanded since then. And we'll go into kind of some of the other initiatives that have developed. Sorry, something just bleeped on my thing. Anyway, on the whole, the network is built around collaboration and is comprised of 8 institutions and 1 repository. And this means that we have approximately 30 people who are part of this network, and it's growing. So our mission really is to enable data repositories to support researchers in ethically making their data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we are currently doing this through 3 different initiatives. The first is through expert curation. And in this capacity, members of the network share the expertise of their staff to curate research data. And this means, or for example, if you have a MATLAB file that was submitted at like the University of Illinois and they don't have the expertise or the time to curate it, they can send it to the network, and through like a subject matrix or through a file format matrix of expertise, it gets matched up with somebody who has that expertise within the network and is sent to them for curation, and then back to the original institution to work with the local faculty member to ensure that it's eventually deposited on the repository. So another initiative that's really developed or sort of expanded through this project is the Dcn Resources. And these are documents or other resources that have been created throughout the project and that are meant to have broad appeal or use to the curator community. So they include the primers, as we'll discuss in a minute, but there are also basic checklists and workshop content that is available for reuse. So finally, we have the Dcn Education Initiative. Currently grant funded, these specialized workshops are a peer-to-peer hands-on learning opportunity for librarians and other data curators. It's really an intense 1.5 days that provides deep dives into curation practices. So for those of you that would like a more in-depth update on the Data Curation Network activities, RDAP, as Jonathan mentioned, had a webinar a couple of weeks ago about the project as a whole, and that is available, that recording is available on the RDAP website. So you can feel free to go back to that and learn more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, who is going to talk more about the data curation or the data education initiatives.
Slide. Oh, thank you. Hello, I'm Hannah Hadley. I'm the project manager for the 2018 through 2020 Specialized Data Curation Workshops, and we are generously funded by our IMLS grant. Slide. Our grant is supporting 3 free specialized data curation workshops. The first one was co-located at the DLF Forum on October 17th of 2018. And the end result of that, the primers that you'll be hearing about today, are from that group. We do have a second group from Johns Hopkins University that occurred on April 17th through 18th of this year. They're halfway into the process of primer creation, so you'll hear more about them soon. And then we have an upcoming workshop that will occur at Washington University in St. Louis on November 5th and 6th of this year. The applications are open until August 2nd. So please do apply for those. We also have some scholarships available that cover diversity, new professionals, and students. So please consider applying for those. Slide. And pictured is just kind of a glimpse into the workshop experience. So our curriculum is based from the DCN's curated steps, which are also used for the Data Curation Network's curator training. Liza Coburn in our last RDAP webinar had mentioned that when she was discussing the network itself. At our workshops, each step is explored in more depth through hands-on activities, demonstrations, and lectures. And the steps also provide a common understanding of the curation process that can be applied towards the creation of the primers. Slide. So what exactly is a data curation primer? So it is a concise, actionable resource to assist data curators in adding value to a data set. So these are not going to be something that are very long, but it's just the relevant information for a given topic. And they're meant to jumpstart the curation process. Slide. So the primer creation process begins at the workshop. So in addition to the curriculum teaching those curated steps to get everyone on the same page, we brainstorm primer topics, and then we have a sign-up sheet so that by the second day, because it is an intense 1.5 days, so by the second day, the groups are able to form. We have the sign-up sheet for that. And each group will receive a roadmap and a primer template. The roadmap has things in it, like it explains what a primer is, what a primer might contain, because there is some variability as to what it may contain, and then it gives them kind of an idea of the timeline that they'll be working in. DCN mentors, those are people who are in the data curation network, and there's one at least that will be assigned to each group. And the groups are going to meet about every month for that 6-month period. A primer draft is submitted for peer review about halfway throughout that process, and that co-occurs with a webinar. You can see the previous webinar for that group through our website. The revisions will be made based upon those review recommendations, and then final submissions are published to GitHub. That is the actual living primer, the versioned primer, but we do have archival copies of version 1.0 that are published to the University of Minnesota's Drum repository, and that just, you know, it gives a little bit more visibility to the primer, as well as highlights this project. Slide. So for this webinar, we asked each primer group to introduce their primer format or topic. We asked them for the key curatorial considerations that they gave, and also some possible future directions for their primer. Slide. And let's begin with NetCDF. Unfortunately, Sophie was not able to make it today, so we do have her DCN mentor, Susan Borda, who will be speaking for her today.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. Yeah, this is, as Hannah mentioned, this is Susan Borda. I'm the data workflow specialist at the University of Michigan, and I worked with Sophie to help her basically assist her in the process of creating this NetCDF primer along with Jake Carlson, my manager. You want to, next, please? Next slide. Thank you. This primer topic, NetCDF, is basically an expansion on a previous product created here at Michigan, a data curation format profile, which is essentially our version of the primer. I know, Cynthia, you hate that, but there it is. Anyway, but what Sophie did, since she was working at NCAR at the time, is she expanded the previous primer by adding in an actual walkthrough using one of their data sets, in particular the NCAR Global Climate 4-Dimensional Data Assimilation Hourly 40 km reanalysis data set. It's a bit of a mouthful, from their data archive, using also one of their tools, which is the integrated data viewer, developed by their counterpart, the university, the UCAR group. So go ahead, one more. Thank you. The key components of this is she was introducing the research data archive from NCAR's research data archive, as well as adding some new questions and answers, actually some answers to the key questions to answer that we had created for the first version of this. So this is actually a really nice example of what you can do if one of these is already created, how you can expand it for future use. But she did a really great job of walking through the process of finding the data in their system, in the NCAR system, as well as using the tool that they have, the viewer. I walked through it myself after she created it and worked like a champ, and it's a really nice addition to the previous primer. The future directions of this are basically maybe use a different data set, not an NCAR one or a Michigan data set, and also to continue to add new examples and expand on what Sophie has done and expand on what Michigan did to begin with. I think that's it, but you can go ahead one more. I think I'm done. Yep.
Thank you, Susan.
Yep, and I have to head back to Globus World, Michigan. So if people have questions, you can contact me directly or work through this system and they'll give me the questions.
And then our next speaker will be Ho-Jung Yu from Microsoft Excel.
Great, thanks, Hannah. My name is Ho-Jung Yu. I co-authored the Excel primer with Greg Janae of UC Santa Barbara and Sandra Sawchuk of Mount St. Vincent University. So let's dive right in. Next slide. The current Excel file format, XLSX, is technically a zip archive that contains a number of related OpenXML files. Excel files are commonly used in many disciplines, and they are frequently deposited in data repositories. The format is closely associated with a proprietary application. This and the format's complexity make it difficult to create new tools that fully support the format. So problems can appear when moving files across applications, operating systems, or even different versions of Excel on the same platform, and these will limit their long-term reusability. Researchers use Excel for various purposes. These roughly fall into 4 categories, and we provide an example for each of these uses in the primer. The most common usage of files deposited in repositories is likely to be for storage of tabular data, so we focus on this particular usage. Next slide. The primer outlines common problems curators may encounter. For example, upon opening files, we may come across password protection or the presence of macros, which can create external file dependencies. When the purpose of the file is data storage, converting the file to the CSV format is a standard recommendation for data preservation because CSVs are more portable across applications and they're not tied to a proprietary application. But Excel contains commonly used features that aren't supported by many other tools. These include external references to cells in other worksheets or files, visual effects like conditional formatting, and hidden content such as comments. These features can contain important information that gets lost when files are saved in CSV. Next slide. There is no metadata standard for Excel files, so detailed documentation from the depositor is strongly encouraged. The documentation may be a data dictionary, a codebook, or a README file, depending on context. But regardless of format, the documentation should have information about the context of the original study, a description of each file and worksheet in each file, what was changed in each version of the data, and a description of each variable in the file. The Excel Primer includes links to some of the documentation guides available for different disciplines. Next slide. Finally, the Primer includes a few recommendations for maximizing long-term reusability. First, it recommends converting XLS files, which are not in an open format, to XLSX, which is. Also, we recommend removing any macros that aren't integral to the file, as well as external file dependencies, because they can break in the future. And finally, when possible, ask the researcher to convert XLSX to CSV and embedded charts into standard image formats. If storage space isn't limiting, then it may not hurt to preserve both versions of the file. But keep in mind that the feasibility of converting an Excel file depends on its primary purpose. For files that were used for data entry or as computational tools, where formatting is an integral part of the user interface, converting to CSV is likely to be inappropriate because too much functionality of the original Excel file will be lost. And that summarizes the Excel Primer.
Thank you, Ho-Jung. And the next group is Microsoft Access, and Fernando Rios will be.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Hello, can you go to the next one, please? Okay, good. So I worked with Dave Viron on curating MS Access databases. So, you know, for better or for worse, people are going to use MS Access for a variety of things. So MS Access, if you're not familiar with it, is a widely used relational database system. People use it all the time in business for things like you know, order tracking or inventory. In the sciences, say like earth or ecological sciences, people will use it for, you know, raw data collection or field samples, you know, cataloging field samples and taking notes. You know, same thing with social sciences or archaeology, surveys, site data collection, and artifact metadata and so forth. And even in the lab, it's pretty common for things like, you know, keeping track of lab supplies or inventories, or even doing things like tracking experiments. So the common curation issues that might come up, you know, reflect some of the ones that were already mentioned for Excel, but, you know, it's a proprietary format, right? And there's really no official documentation on what goes on behind the scenes. A lot of the stuff that you find online is actually stuff that people have kind of just figured out through reverse engineering. A big issue is that there's really no one MS Access format. There's several versions and formats that may or may not have the same file extension, and that kind of complicates things a little bit when trying to open up the files. And of course, there's a huge variation in how it's used and just in the general proficiency of how people apply the tool and if they follow best practices or not. Next slide. So some of the key challenges, still on the topic of file format, you might have seen if you've ever worked with Access, either a .mdb file or a .accdb file. These are two different incompatible formats that were used in different versions of Microsoft Office. And even within the same format, say for example, MDB, there can be different subformats. So an Office 95 MDB may not be openable in later versions of Office, for example. However, we determined that Access 2013 seems to be the best choice right now in terms of opening the most kinds of files. But there's really no one program that can open everything. And actually, the Library of Congress has done a pretty good job of compiling and going into more detail on the differences between these MDB and ACCDB files. Another challenge is that there's really no preservation standard. It's a proprietary format, so people haven't really, just because you can't look inside, you can't really, come up with something structured. Issues around fairness. A lot of the databases that we saw when we were developing the primer weren't really what I would say curation ready, in that they weren't documented, they weren't really described or items named in a way that could be understood. And sometimes they even contained linked tables, which means that the data lived in a separate location, not within the database itself, which made it harder to curate. Next slide. So some of the key considerations are, what's the complexity of the database? So something like a simple database that only has, a few tables, no forms or queries or macros, really can be curated like a spreadsheet. However, if there's anything more than that, if it's been used for data entry, or there's a lot of macros in there, it could need a lot more work. But as a base level, we recommend that definitely keep the original database files, but also export all the tables to flat CSV files. And at the same time, run the relationship diagram tool, which is the screenshot you see there. And that captures how the different tables are related, or rather which tables are related. To actually find out how the tables are related and the meaning of those relationships really needs help from the creator themselves to document that. But apart from that, Access does have a built-in database documenter, which automatically generates a report of all the metadata that's already been placed into the database by the author. So it's always a good idea to run that to kind of document each object. And always check for linked tables as well. Yeah, next slide. So for the future directions, just really refining the steps that I outlined in the previous slide for basic curation, and highlight it with some use cases, I think would be a really good idea. And a really interesting aspect of future direction would be to really explore some of these third-party tools. These third-party tools basically enable you to open up databases without having to have Access installed. And the reason you'd want to use these tools is because they can do things that Access can't natively, such as bulk exports, for example. So here I've collected a few different tools that I identified as being potentially pretty good at enabling curation. Most of them aren't free, but the last one here, MDB Admin, is free and open source. So I think that could be a really good starting point to develop a more community and curation-oriented database tool that doesn't require Access. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Fernando. Our next group is Jupyter Notebooks and is represented by Dana Boquin.
Hello. I guess I can probably just move on to the next slide because it's a copy. Kind of go back one, please. So the primer that we developed for Jupyter Notebooks, so like my co-authors and I, we're just calling it a primer for curators as opposed to data curators, and I will get into that just like in a second, but I think that it was important for us when we first started developing the primer, and you can go to the next slide, is that we wanted to point out that essentially one of the things that's really different about Jupyter Notebooks is just by their very nature, they're a very different type of object than a lot of the other file formats that people started developing primers for. So if you're not familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, essentially they're composite digital objects. And what I mean by that is essentially there's a lot of different pieces, and they, depending on kind of what the functionality is of the notebook itself, it may or may not have a lot more complexity to it because they're used to kind of both do development, so actually develop software, but they're also used to kind of house and bundle up documentation so that you can share it. That goes like what goes with your software can be used just to view someone else's work, and it can actually be used to execute all sorts of different functions. So they're not just like a static object that you can say is done. And the different kinds of expectations people are going to have for them when they download them from your repository aren't just going to be as simple as like the macros work or they don't, or the, I don't know, the images won't render. It's going to be that you can't actually figure out what it was supposed to say. So if you haven't used one before, you kind of type your code into different kinds of cells. There's lots of different types of cells and kind of a template. And depending on what you put in those and the type of cell they are, you may or may not expect a certain functionality. So if that cell had a function in it and the thing that you're supposed to be able to tell from that function is a certain output, you might not be able to tell what that output was. It's not just a matter of like trying to look at what the code was. So I guess next slide. That gets down to kind of this last piece about what makes them a little different. I would make this bigger if I could, if I could justify making the font bigger. But essentially, Jupyter Notebooks are a piece of software that is made up of lots of different components. So you have like the file for the notebook itself, but you also have the web app that runs it in your browser. You also need to have the kernel to render the different programming language that you're using installed. And so this is not data the way that I think some of the other bits of information, the other primers might be talking about it. And so depending on what you're trying to do with it and what you're trying to enable, you have to make different considerations. So next slide. There's different metadata expectations then for different functionality that your depositor might expect. So we kind of borrowed in our primer from work that was done with the Software Sustainability Institute and JISC in defining different types of minimal deposits. So we developed kind of recommendations for Jupyter Notebooks for curators to kind of go through and make sure that depending on different expectations a depositor might have, these are the things that a curator would have to do. So next slide. So there's a lot to consider. We wound up, rather than coming up with kind of like a, I guess, a set of standards to go through no matter what, we came up with an example of a curatorial decision tree to walk people through kind of what actions should be taken given different scenarios. Because it's also true that these different types of deposits are going to require different types of metadata elements. And so kind of thinking really critically about when you accept a deposit of a Jupyter notebook, whether it's a supplement to something else or a standalone type of object, you have to consider whether or not your repository can really be the right place for it. So hoping that more people give us feedback on it and it just gets better and more fleshed out from here.
Thank you, Dana. And then the next group up is Geodatabases, which is going to be represented by Andrew Batista.
Hi, hello everybody. So I worked with, I'm Andrew Batista, the librarian for GIS at New York University, and I worked with Tom Brittanecker, Zenobi Garrett, Jennifer Moore, and Curie Perman on this Geodatabases primer. I put links here to the preservation copy and then the GitHub repository in the hopes that people will take a look at it and continue to offer feedback and suggestions. We're definitely amenable to it. So go ahead, next slide. So for those who don't know, a geodatabase is a geospatial data file format that I think emerged for a litany of practical reasons that have to do with any version of the following, like the size of a file, the shape file, which is the standard, industry standard vector geospatial data format, is limited to 2 gigabytes. And oftentimes geodatabases can be more efficient ways to store either large data sets or data sets with multiple geometry features, or even multiple kinds of data, such as raster data or digital elevation data in the same package. So I think that these are particularly complex files because they sort of exist for practical reasons and have a lot to do with how researchers compile research. So some of the challenges of them are, as you'll see in a second, just that it can be very difficult to open a geodatabase and look at its file contents in a file folder or from a command line and make sense of what's there. Like you kind of have to open it within ArcMap or geodatabase software. It is a proprietary format, although recently there has been the ability to open a version of it in QGIS, which is an open source software. Again, I think that one of the challenges is trying to disambiguate what kind of information is within a geodatabase and then figure out why and how to document that. And then finally, our primer talks a lot about considerations with not only making metadata in documentation, but how to package it, both to adhere to industry standards for metadata, which are XML schema, ISO 19139, or FGDC, versus creating documents that could be indexed into GeoBlacklight or other solar systems, or solar-based discovery systems. So these are, I would say, at the top level highlights of what our primer covers. All right, next slide. So this is a screenshot, as I alluded to a second ago, of if you're familiar with geospatial data, this is a layer that's added into a canvas, and then you can see that there's many different kinds of features or parts of this. So that perennial question of part to whole when you're describing the contents of data, I think, comes into play here. You can see that it's a little easier to determine what you're looking at when you open this in ArcMap, rather than just looking at it through Finder or the folder in Windows 10. Okay, next slide. So some of the major benefits of our primer, we went through great painstaking steps to talk about how to convert some or portions of the geodatabase into individual files. And then we have advice on opening geodatabases with multiple formats in them, and then advice to generate standard metadata, discipline standard metadata. You can see in this screenshot here, this is an example of a curatorial choice we made locally at NYU to create a geodatabase into an open source version to kind of liberate it from its its proprietary format. So, okay, next slide. I think this is the last one. So future directions, I think definitely adding to this by creating a primer for shapefiles would be useful for the community. But also the questions that kept coming up for us have a lot to do with the fact that Esri itself continues to change directions in terms of how geospatial data is passed along. And it's unclear how or to what extent this file format will continue to be used. And so, you know, we definitely recommend preserving it as is, but I think there's a lot of individual choices you can make. So, okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next group is SPSS, and the speaker is Joshua Dull.
Hello, everyone. I'm assuming everyone can hear me, so I'm just going to keep on talking. I'm here to represent our SPSS group, as well for Sai, Shahira, Janine, and our amazing mentor, Sophia. So you can go to the next slide, please. So we're talking about SPSS, which is it's not really a file format, but it's also more than just sort of a software. So we kind of end up in that in-between place, sort of like Jupyter Notebooks, where we're not really talking about curating SPSS, but we had to be more specific and sort of what kind of outputs from SPSS are we curating? And we're really focused on sort of the data, which I may refer to as observations or rows, but essentially the data that is being stored in some sort of SPSS format, which could be an SAV file or a POR file for portable. And those were the two that we sort of decided to focus on because they were the most popular or most common. But also after talking to researchers, it's typically the kind of formats that people are saving their data as. So we really had to decide on like what is important to keep with all these different potential outputs and file types from SPSS. And so we sort of included an appendix to our primer with more detailed information about all these other types of file types while we sort of focused on the main type, which is the sort of SAV file. And an SAV file is essentially the data or observations from data, but it also includes metadata about the variables. So the variable type, you know, whether it's an integer, a float, a string, descriptions of a variable, and other sort of metadata about the variable. So it's both data and metadata all packaged in one file. So that becomes sort of confusing for curation because you need to know what to expect out of these files. So we had to think a lot about metadata and how metadata might be mapped in SPSS files and how that might apply to something like Dublin Core, sort of a common metadata schema for repository. But we also sort of had to think of, you know, what are we curating for here? We really took a focus on curating for reuse so that these components, data, et cetera, can be reused in the future, which meant focusing on the fact that we would want the actual data or observations as well as, you know, the variables are documented, that there are any README files or any sort of project level information that's necessary to sort of reuse this data in the future. And then on the next slide, we sort of talk a little more in detail about what we sort of considered for curation, particularly with preservation in mind. We had to sort of think of whether we wanted to recommend things be saved in the SAV format, which is proprietary to SPSS. It also tends to be version locked, so it's a little hard to sort of go back in time with different versions, but the POR format or the portable format is meant to be more open to different versions of SPSS. We also had the thought of do we ASCII or not ASCII? You know, do we want a plain text version of this data or not? And so we decided to look at different repositories and organizations and base our sort of recommendations off what the sort of community was recommending on how to handle SPSS for preservation. And a lot of these preservation networks or societies or organizations recommend keeping the original SPSS files, whether it's an SAV file or a portable file, whatever the original format that the researcher gives you, but to also convert and create a plain text copy or a CSV copy with an accompanying metadata or code book. That way you could have the sort of portability of a plain text file, but also you wouldn't necessarily lose the kind of interesting information that you can all contain in one sort of SAV file from SPSS. So some other things we had to consider were versions of SPSS. Like I mentioned, it tends to be sort of from one version to the next, you don't know whether a file will open or whether you'll lose information. So we try to put some information about versions in there. We also got feedback from researchers about realistically what kind of files do researchers save from SPSS. And a lot of that information is in our primer so that curators can get that sort of actual information that way researchers think about SPSS. And then some other highlights from our primer were that we put in links to SPSS tutorials, which would be handy for using SPSS to convert this data into other formats, as well as a lengthy bibliography around other sort of curation resources and preservation resources particular to SPSS. And that should be it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. And then our final lightning talk is the WordPress Primer, and the speaker is Heather James.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, for the introduction. I'm hoping that my volume is okay, not too soft, not too loud. So yes, this is a primer on WordPress.com, HTML website hosting service. And I, of course, would like to say a huge thank you to my mentor, Lisa Johnston at University of Minnesota, because I worked on this on my own, and therefore she was a huge resource and incredibly patient in helping me get through this. So to start with, why WordPress.com, you know, this came from a very practical need in my particular position, in that we have multiple faculty members who had already created their own research-related sites on WordPress.com because of the free hosting possibilities there, and no longer want to be responsible for maintaining them, but don't want the loss of the content. So it was just a point of need. But I would like to point out, of course, many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with WordPress.com. In 2019, it was on the list for best website builders in PC Mag, on CNET, on Tech Radar. It's consistently listed with Wix and Weebly as being one of the best free option website hosting platforms, and it's one of the ones that also allows for site portability, which is important when it comes to the curation process. Also, just to clarify in the very beginning, this primer is about WordPress.com, not WordPress.org. WordPress.com is a private hosting platform that uses the open source WordPress.org software to create the websites. That's very important at the get-go, and inside the primer there is a sort of referential, how can you tell if it's a WordPress.com site, particularly when people pay the extra freemium fees to control the domain and have the public-facing domain not say WordPress.com. Okay, so if you could advance forward, Hannah. Just looking through the process, the DCN process for curated. The WordPress.com curation and export is not a high technological threshold, but there is a lot of project management that goes into it, a lot of thinking through who and why and what will be curated. So one of the very first questions that I would recommend for a curator to consider would be, what are the goals of the depositor? Will the live site be maintained afterwards? And how comfortable is the depositor in either being part of the process or in handing over the reins? So one of the options that's discussed in the primer that could be implemented would be for the curator to actually have their own WordPress.com account and to have the live site transferred over to them, so that the curator would be able to be the one actually making the selections about the export process. I would also suggest considering scans, archive.org, or other screen captures to preserve the layout and a visual accompaniment to the XML file that will come out. And what are the expectations for how it will look in the curated collection? In my case, it goes into a digital commons repository, and so everything is going to be a download file. When the export comes out, you have an XML document of the text and the content of the site, and then the media files in whatever format they were originally uploaded to the site are zipped out as a tar file. The metadata for those files is often not there in the export, so a lot of back and forth with the depositor is going to be necessary, and creating that documentation to go along, whether it be in the form of a README file or other explanatory format, particularly for the names to explain the handles that are listed in the XML, and any major dates for changes and metadata to accompany the media files. If you could go forward, Hannah. Of course, the metadata for the collection itself and whether or not it's, all of those other components such as screen captures accompany the XML and the media files themselves. That's up to the curator and what system they're on. There are 3 namespaces implemented in the XML document that comes out from WordPress. One of them, it's not currently possible to find an index for because it's proprietary to WordPress.com. One of the things to consider would be, XML in and of itself is very compatible with screen readers, but ADA accessibility, particularly if, which is a popular option, you take the XML and have it transformed into a PDF. And there are some recommendations for file formats that will do that for you, programs that will do that for you. And last slide. The last thing going forward is that this really started with the free version of WordPress.com as a baseline. There are business accounts and freemium versions that allow for different plugins. Some of those plugins handle the exporting on their own, and so there's a wide variation of what someone might encounter when that's at play. And of course, going forward into dealing with the WordPress.org software itself, the open source code would be another potential future primer. Thank you, Hannah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Heather. And thanks to all of our speakers. And we just want to open it now. If anyone has any questions, you can put those in the chat and we'll read them out.
And while questions are coming in, I just want to thank everyone, all the presenters and everybody who worked on the primers for what really appeals to me is kind of a community-driven resource, practical approaches to dealing with some of these data curation issues in a hands-on way. I think a lot of us have encountered a situation where somebody wants to curate or preserve a file like an Access database or a blog, and just having a resource like this as a starting point is very helpful. We did have one question that came in on the chat early on about when the folks who had applied for the St. Louis workshop, when those would be approved, and so the notifications for those are going to be going out on August 9th. If anyone else has any other questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. And while we're waiting, actually, I have a question that came up about citing the primers. I noticed from the Excel primer, there was one of the cells, one of the fields in the primer itself included how to cite. And so I can see where these primers might be cited when used for research, but I'm also interested in how the network is sort of keeping track of when the primers are actually used to curate some data, and how that sort of gets added to your metrics and your impact as a network.
Yeah, excellent question. So we mostly included the citations because we felt like, it was important for anybody who builds upon the original primers to refer back to and show attribution to the original sort of creators. We haven't really talked through like how use of the primers might be reflected. That's interesting because obviously it's not part of the current workflow for a lot of curation or I guess in tracking provenance or documenting what you do through the curation process. It could be indicated there, but that's again not something we've really discussed. Interesting question. Does anybody else have thoughts about this that are on the call? I think you all have the ability to unmute yourself too, so I'd be interested to know what others think.
I know that tracking was something that we had discussed wanting to possibly develop just last week in our DCN all hands meeting, but we don't really have a process outlined for that yet.
I would add too, at base, the preservation copies that are at the University of Minnesota have a pretty nice suggested cite thing, or how to cite this resource, that you can just copy and paste, just as a basic, way of acknowledging. But yeah, I concur that, like, to my knowledge, we haven't thought about ways in which either specific parts of these primers or just the way in which they inform choices has been made. And also I would add, I'm newer to the data curation network than others as well. And I guess I'm eager to see how like certain recommendations or choices are made or not made because of referring to the primers as a sort of external authority or advice.
Yeah, I know just sort of anecdotally, we've had some feedback from others outside of the DCN, just, through conversations about the primers and actually the curate checklist. And so we're trying to go back and kind of incorporate some of that that feedback. A lot of it has to do with certain file types or file formats, not like the checklist not being kind of adequate. And I think like the curate checklist was meant to be sort of this general thing. And so the primers are really sort of more of this jumpstart or deep dive into very file format or software specific or those kinds of considerations. So yeah, any and all feedback is really good. So if folks want to contribute that kind of information, that would be amazing. Are there other questions?
And I was going to mention something too, Cynthia, that the primers don't just have to be about a file format. This first group focused on that, and I believe the second group has also kind of gone the same way. But internally through the DCN, we're working on primers on human subjects, on curating human subjects. So it can be something like that as well.
And this is John again, and I had another question come up while the presenters were going through the primers. Thinking about, for example, when we're working with researchers on developing data management plans, and a lot of the work that's going on now and conversations that are going on right now around machine actionable plans, and thinking about how one of these primers would be a great resource to refer to, for example, in the section on how the data will be managed over time and how the data will be preserved. To just be able to have a pointer to say, these data will be curated according to the practices laid out within the primer and include a link to it by reference. Is that something that has come up in your discussions? Is that something that the librarians at your institutions have started to do or given thought to?
Not at my institution, but that's really an interesting idea. Like it's almost like used as a protocol or something, you would say, for curation, which I think is maybe a term many researchers are kind of familiar with. One thing that has kind of come up that I know Susan at the University of Michigan is exploring more is these primers are primarily developed for data curators, right? It's how to know what software to use to open the file, what are the preservation considerations, what key challenges are you going to have for curation. but at the University of Michigan, they're also looking into developing these for researchers, so that if you land on a repository page for a specific data set, you can download a primer about how to do some of the same things, how to open the file, how to run it, those kinds of things. And I don't know if Jake is still on the call, but maybe he can kind of expand on that idea. Jake, are you here?
Hey, Cynthia. Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, so we're very early in sort of exploring that idea of sort of repurposing primers, not just for use when we get a data set, but to try to reach out and connect to researchers about the kind of work that we do and the kind of work that we'll be looking for in curating data sets, to sort of start it earlier in the research process. So we don't quite know exactly what that means yet, or how we'll repurpose the primers for that purpose, but it's definitely something we're working on.
Cool. Well, if there's no other questions, anybody can feel free to email any of the team members or any of the primer authors themselves for additional feedback or thoughts. Oh, so this is just, I'm jumping ahead, or I guess I'm wrapping up, Hannah. So these, after the second workshop, these are the second primers that are currently about halfway in development, and should be released in, what are we saying, Hannah?
I think we're going to have a deadline. It's probably going to be about the second week of August. So they should be released sometime in August. So you can expect those soon. And we will also have a primer sharing webinar for that.
Are you sure? Okay, I think we should double check that date and let folks know a little bit. So look for these to come out. And obviously, thank you again to everyone who is involved in this project. These are all the primer authors. And then obviously the Data Curation Network, IMLS Education Subgroup. They've developed the curriculum. They've been mentors for all of these primer groups, and especially Hannah Hadley, who has been just instrumental in sort of facilitating this whole process. It's really grown under her leadership. And of course, I encourage everybody who's on the call to get involved, to share your expertise. Look at those primers that are on GitHub or the archived versions that are on Drum. That's the University of Minnesota's data repository. Use them, give us feedback, contribute yourself. All of these things are options. If you have ideas for other primers as well, like you have your own thoughts, like let's build our community as best we can and support one another as much as possible. So with that, I think we're done, unless anybody has any other thoughts.
I am just going to mention real quick that most of the primers are published to GitHub now. You can find copies of version 1.0. All of those are published to Drum already, but we should have all of the primers up to GitHub by the end of the week.
Cool. Anything else, John?
No, I just want to say on behalf of RDAP, thank you, Cynthia and Hannah and all of the presenters for a really good, interesting webinar, and we'll be sharing it out as soon as we can here in the next few days.
Thank you all.
Thank you.